The differences between different kinds of Orientalisms are, in effect, the differences between different experiences of what is called the Orient. I mean, the difference between Britain and France on the one hand and the United States on the other is that Britain and France had colonies in the Orient. I mean, they had a long-standing relationship and imperial role in a place like India. You know? So that there's a kind of a archive of actual experiences of being in India, of ruling the country for several hundred years, right? And the same with the French in North Africa, let's say Algeria or Indochina, direct colonial experience. In the case of the Americans, the experience is much less direct. I mean, there's never been an American occupation of the Near East. So I would say the difference between British and French Orientalism on the one hand and the American experience of the Orient on the other is that the American one is much more indirect. It's much more based on abstractions. The second big thing, I think, that differs in the American experience from the British and the French of Orientalism is that American Orientalism is very politicized by the presence of Israel, for which America is the main ally.
And President Clinton and I are proud, as are all Americans, that the United States was the first nation to recognize the State of Israel 11 minutes after you proclaimed your independence.
And what you have, in effect, is the creation of a Jewish state in the middle of the Islamic Oriental world. And the sense that because it's a Jewish state and a Western state, self-declared, there's a greater coincidence between American interests there than there is between American interests, let's say, in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, which are important because of oil. I think the presence of this other factor, which is very anti-Islamic, where Israel regards the whole Arab world as its enemy, is imported into American Orientalism. I mean, the idea, for example, that Hamas terrorists on the West Bank are just interested in killing Jewish children is what you derive from looking at this stuff. And very little attention is paid to the fact that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has been going on for 30 years. It's the longest military occupation in this century. And so you get the impression that the only problem is that, you know, Israeli security is threatened by Hamas and suicide bombs and all the rest of it. And nothing is said about the hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians who are dispossessed and living miserable lives as the direct result of what Israel has done and is doing. So there's a sense in which the Arab struggle for national independence and, in the case of the Palestinians, for national self-determination is looked at with great hostility as upsetting the stabilities of the status quo. And that makes it virtually impossible. It's a tragedy, virtually impossible for an American to see on television, to read books, to see films about the Middle East that are not colored politically by this conflict, in which the Arabs are almost always play the role of terrorists and violent people and irrational and so on and so forth.
That's another thing that America really needs to think about is our racism that comes from the United States towards Muslim people and towards Arabic people. And that's something that has to stop. And the United States has to start respecting people from the Middle East in order to find a solution to the problem that's been building up over many years. So I thank everyone for your patience and letting me speak my mind on that.
Many people believe the way that Americans understand the Muslim world is very problematic. Indeed, anti-Arab racism seems to be almost officially sanctioned. You can make generalized and racist statements about Arab peoples that would not be tolerated for any other group. At the heart of how this new American Orientalism operates is the threatening and demonized figure of the Islamic terrorist that is emphasized by journalists and Hollywood. Now, Saeed recognizes that terrorism exists as a result of the violent political situation in the Middle East. But he argues that there is a lot more going on there that is misunderstood or not seen by the peoples of the West. The result of the media's focus on one negative aspect alone means that all the peoples of the Islamic world come to be understood in the same negative and paranoid way. That is, as a threat. So that when we think of people who look like that and who come from that part of the world, we think fanatic, extreme, violent. Said argues that understanding a vast and complex region like the Middle East in this narrow way takes away from the humanity and diversity of millions of ordinary people living decent and humane lives there.
We asked, would he plant a bomb to blow up the Americans if the Islamic underground asked him to? The answer was yes.
After I'd written Orientalism and a book called The Question of Palestine in the early 80s, in the late 70s rather, and beginning of the 80s, I wrote a third book, which is called Covering Islam, and I thought of them as a kind of trilogy. And Covering Islam was an account of the coverage of Islam in the popular media, immediately occasioned by the Iranian Revolution, which described itself, as you recall, as an Islamic revolution. And, you know, what I discovered was a huge arsenal of images employed by the media. Large masses of people waving their fists, black banners, you know, the stern-faced Khomeini, all of them giving an impression of the utmost negative, sort of evil emanation. So the impression you got of Islam was that it was a frightening, mysterious, above all threatening, as if the main business of Muslims was to threaten and try to kill Americans. As recently as last year, 1996, that is to say almost 16 or 17 years after I wrote Covering Islam, I did an update of the book, and I wrote a new introduction. And I found, quite to my horror and surprise, that during those 16 or 17 years, with the large number of events in the Islamic world taking place, which you would think would allow for more familiarity with a more refined sense of what was taking place on, let's say, as reflected in television and print journalism, in fact was the opposite. I think the situation got worse, and that what you had instead now was a much more threatening picture of Islam, represented, for example, by a television film called Jihad in America, based on the bombing of the World Trade Center.
I've reported on international terrorism for the past 10 years. And since the World Trade Center bombing, I've been investigating the networks of Islamic extremists committed to jihad in America. For these militants, jihad is a holy war, an armed struggle to defeat non-believers or infidels. And their ultimate goal is to establish an Islamic empire. But this gathering did not take place in the Middle East. It happened in the heartland of America, Kansas City, Missouri. Combating these groups within the boundaries of the Constitution will be the greatest challenge to law enforcement since the war on organized crime.
But never the same generalizations were made, let's say, about the Oklahoma City bombing, that this was a Christian fundamentalist, et cetera, et cetera. But the Islamic jihad had come to America, and you had these scenes of the most irresponsible journalism, where you'd see people talking in Arabic and then a voiceover saying, and they're discussing the destruction of America. Whereas if you picked up a little of what was being said, if you knew the language, it had nothing to do with that. And that Islam and the teachings of Islam became synonymous with terror, and the demonization of Islam allowed for very little distinction between piety, let's say, and violence. The so-called independent media in a liberal society like this, in effect, are so lazy and are controlled by interests that are commercial and political at the same time, that there is no investigative reporting. It's just basically repeating the line of the government.
Only 8 days ago, I concluded a broadcast on the World Trade Center bombing by telling you what senior U.S. law enforcement officials were telling us, that the threat of Muslim extremists operating within the United States is an ongoing danger, something we'll have to live with from now on.
And repeating the lines of the people who have the most influence, for whom Islam is a useful foreign demon to turn attention away from the inequities and problems in our own society. So, as a result, the human side of the Islamic and especially Arabic world are rarely to be found. And the net result is this vacancy on the one hand, and these easy, almost automatic images of terror and violence. There is a handy set of images and cliches, you know, not just from the newspapers and the television, but from movies.
Oh, I come from a land, from a faraway place, where the caravan camels roam. Where it's flat and immense and the heat is intense. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. When the wind's from the east and the sun's from the west and the sand and the glass is right, come on down, stop on by, hop a carpet and fly to another Arabian night.
I mean, I myself, growing up in the Middle East, in Palestine and Cairo, used to delight in films on the Arabian Nights, you know, done by Hollywood producers, you know, with John Hall and Maria Montez and Sabu. I mean, they were talking about a part of the world that I lived in, but it had this kind of exotic, magical quality, which was what we call today Hollywood. So there was that whole repertory of the sheiks and the desert and the galloping around and the scimitars and the dancing girls and all. That's really the material. The situation in the popular media is basically that Muslims are really two things. One, they're villains of one sort, villains and fanatics.
I will dispatch the American people to the hell they deserve.
And B, many films end up with huge numbers of bodies, Muslim bodies, strewn all over the place, the result of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Demi Moore, Chuck Norris. Lots of films about guerrillas going in to kill Muslim terrorists. So the idea of Islam is something that to be stamped out. The whole history of these Orientalist representations, which portrayed the Muslim and the Oriental as, in effect, a lesser breed. In other words, the only thing they understand is the language of force. This is the principle here, that unless you give them a bloody nose, they won't understand. We can't talk reason with them. Is the Arab world full of terrorists? Well, I mean, all you have to do is sort of break down the question into common sense and say, there are terrorists, as there are everywhere. But, you know, there's a lot more going on there. I mean, we're talking about 250, 300 million people. And one of the great problems with Orientalism to begin with is these vast generalizations about Islam and the nature of Islam. I mean, there's very little in common that you can talk about as Islam, let's say, between Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. They're both Muslim countries, but, you know, the differences in history and language and traditions and so on are so vast that the word Islam has, at best, a tenuous meaning. The same is true within the Arab world. I mean, Morocco is very different from Saudi Arabia. Algeria is very different from Egypt. And I would argue, in fact have argued, that the predominant mood of the Arab world is very secular. You know, it's easy to attract attention, and certainly the media's attention, for some of the political reasons that are obvious. I mean, to discredit the Arabs, to make them seem like a threat to the West, to keep the idea around at the end of the Cold War that, you know, there are foreign devils. Otherwise, what are we doing with this gigantic military? You know, this huge military budget that is twice as much as the entire world's military budget combined. So you have to have threat. And the result is it's very hard to find works that are sympathetic to the Arabs and Islam. Islam is seen as the enemy of Christianity, and the United States sees itself as a Christian or Judeo-Christian country in affiliation with Israel, and that Islam is the great enemy, the competitor. There's a history of that. And I give the example of Dodi Fayad, you know, the erstwhile suitor of Princess Diana. Well, a few days before he died, I read through the English press, and it was full of the racist cliches of Orientalist discourse. I mean, that this is the Sunday Times, one of the leading newspapers in England had a headline to a 15,000-word story entitled "A Match Made in Mecca." And the idea of Muslim conspiracies trying to infect, taking over this white woman by these dark people with Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, who is a historical personage of the 7th century, somehow stage managing the whole thing. That's the power of the discourse, you see. If you're thinking about people and Islam and about that part of the world, those are the words you constantly have to use.
And you won't get hurt! I give you my word!
No way, you wacko!
So discourse is a regulated system of producing knowledge within certain constraints, whereby certain rules have to be observed.
Okay, Libya, exports.
Yes, sir, you American pig.
Nice touch.
To think past it, to go beyond it, not to use it, is virtually impossible, because there's no knowledge that isn't codified in this way about that part of the world.
May I help you? Hayat Fal Philistine. Wabushnia. Listen to the sound of Altar.
And there's a certain sense in which, in not really mounting a serious critique of it, the Arabs have participated and continue to allow themselves to be represented as Orientals in this Orientalist way. There is no, for example, information policy of the 22 Arab countries, to try to give a different picture of what their worlds are like, because most of them are dictatorships. All of them are dictatorships without democracy, who are in desperate need of U.S. patronage, government patronage, to support them. And so they're not about to criticize the United States, not about to engage in a real dialogue. And in that respect, I think the Arabs keep themselves collectively in a way that is subordinate to and inferior to the West, and in fact fulfills the kinds of representations that most Westerners have in their minds about the Arabs.
The attack came without warning, and according to a U.S. government source, told CBS News that it has Middle East terrorism written all over it.
The attack in Oklahoma City appears to have a familiar mark. This was done with the attempt to inflict as many casualties as possible. That is a Middle Eastern trait.
The fact that it was such a powerful bomb in Oklahoma City immediately drew investigators to consider deadly parallels that all have roots in the Middle East.
ABC News has learned that the FBI has asked the U.S. military to provide up to 10 Arabic speakers to help in the investigation.
Well, one of the interesting things about the persistence of Orientalism, I mean, almost, when you think about it, almost astonishing persistence of it was the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995. I can give you a personal example. I was in Canada giving some lectures at the actual time of the bombing. And maybe half an hour after the event had occurred in the afternoon, my office was inundated with phone calls from the media. And I rang my office from Canada, as I frequently do, to find out, if there was any message for me that needed attention and so on. And she said 25 calls had come in from the major networks, from the cable channels, from the major newspapers, news magazines, and so on and so forth, all of them wanting to talk to you. And I said, what about this event in Oklahoma City? And I said, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, apparently somebody had volunteered, one of these instant commentators, that the notion that this seemed like a Middle East-style bombing and that there were a couple of swarthy people around right after the bombing, or seen after the bombing.
Within hours of the explosion, local police and the FBI had issued the all-points bulletin looking for 3 men believed to be of Middle Eastern origin.
And sources tell CBS News that unofficially, the FBI is treating this as a Middle Eastern-related incident. Oklahoma City, I can tell you, is probably considered one of the largest centers of Islamic radical activity outside the Middle East.
And so this got them to think that they should talk to me, not because I had anything to do with it, but because by virtue of being from the Middle East, I would have an insight into this. You know, and of course the proposition is so preposterous and so racist that just if you're from the area, you would understand who and why this is being done. Never thinking for a moment that it was a local, homegrown boy called McVeigh who was, you know, totally American in his outlook and was doing it out of the best principles of American extermination and Ahab-like anger, you know, at the world.